Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here in Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. As we have heard the update on Hunter Biden and his trial, he has been found guilty of the gun charges. And first off, President Joe Biden says that he is going to stand by the guilty verdict and abide by the outcomes of that verdict. The jury found Hunter Biden guilty Tuesday on all 3 federal felony gun charges he faced, concluding that he violated laws meant to prevent drug addicts from owning firearms. The conviction marks the first time a president's immediate family member has been found guilty of a crime during the father's term in office. Through his crimes, Joe Biden tenure as president, in a statement, Hunter Biden said he was disappointed by the guilty verdict, but grateful for his family's love. President Joe Biden expressed support for his son in a statement and said he would respect the judicial process. Hunter Biden could face up to 25 years in prison and up to $750,000 in fines as part of his sentencing. It is expected that Hunter Biden will not get the maximum because it was a first-time offense. But the important thing is also to remember how this is going to reflect on President Joe Biden's campaign as he is running for his next term as President of the United States. Okay, also from the CNN, Gaza protests formed new encampments on UCLA campus, demanding the end to the Israel-Hamas war. At least 25 people were arrested after setting up multiple pro-Palestinian areas at the university that the police said were unlawful. While protests spread at the college campus this spring denouncing Israel's handling of the conflict, UCLA campus turned into a scene of brutality in April when violent counter-protests attacked Palestinian demonstrators. Meanwhile, a U.S.-backed Israeli proposal for ceasefire and hostage deal appears to be in limbo. Okay, so the limbo is that there are still holdouts to the agreements as part of the deal. It is said that by Mr. Blinken that certain factors of the Hamas are still holding out, and there is still a question of if the Parliament of Israel is going to back the agreement that Mr. Blinken and President Joe Biden helped put together. While that all is true, the UN Security Council voted yesterday to back such an agreement, saying that they liked what was in there. The only holdout was Russia, and while they abstained from the vote itself, they didn't use any veto rights to block it. Okay, so have you ever come across a teenager with their head buried into their phone and they look kind of oblivious to whatever else is going around them? They're focused on the screen, they have the earbuds in, and simply don't appear to be paying attention to anything else that is happening around them. A BBC project looking at teenagers with smartphone habits asked 10 college students to swap their beloved devices for basic phones for 5 days. That meant no social media, but also some of the services that make their life easier, such as navigation apps. And the question is, how did all that go on? And I'm going to invite you to check this out on the BBC. We will put a link on the Depictions.media news blog and to this particular article. But as an update from Christian Johnson from the BBC News, will regularly spends more than 8 hours a day staring at a smartphone. When he was younger, he used to love riding his bike. He's 15 now and spends most of his free time after college scrolling through TikTok videos. I'm worried how he'll cope, he says, and he'll have to be sociable with his parents. Ruby, 16, often ignores her parents while scrolling through TikTok, and midway through the experiment, I visited her family, and Ruby acknowledges that she is having a break from her smartphone and has opened up more conversations with her parents. And her mom, Emma, agrees the detox has been a positive impact on her daughter's behavior. Again, we will put a link to that on our news blog at depictions.media. So we're going to hear from the United Nations about the Democratic Republic. It's to say the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and human rights violations or human rights questions about some of the things that are happening. We're going to hear from one side of it with a report to the UN Security Council about what is happening there, and we're going to hear from a stakeout ahead of the report given to the UN Security Council from the representative from the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, as he talks about how the UN Security Council may be becoming more politicized than what its mandate allows, and it overstepping some of the mandates, and how maybe it needs to be reeled back into place because of how they're going after human rights violations with the Northern Koreans, when they are doing an excellent job of feeding people, and they have praises for the North Korean government. So we're going to hear about that and other things that, of course, ongoing process with, of course, Gaza, and how that could actually shape out if everybody agrees to the ceasefire. So why don't we start with the statement made ahead of the UN Security Council meeting on the Northern Korean government and human rights violations.
Buenos días, colleagues. Good morning. I'm pleased and honored to deliver this special communique in connection with the convening of a meeting of the Security Council on the so-called human rights situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The communique reads as follows. The Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations expresses its serious concern at the current and growing threats to the Charter of the United Nations, including those resulting from the continued and ever-increasing encroachment by the Security Council on issues that fall beyond its mandate, as clearly defined in the founding Charter of the United Nations. The member states of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations attach utmost importance to the promotion and protection of all human rights, and also consider that their promotion and protection are strengthened on the basis of dialogue and cooperation. The Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations therefore rejects the convening of meetings for addressing country-specific human rights situations, as such a practice goes against the principles of impartiality, objectivity, transparency, non-selectivity, non-politicization, and non-confrontation, but also against the very spirit of the Charter of the United Nations, while undermining, among others, the development of friendly relations amongst nations and the achievement of international cooperation on the field of human rights. The member states of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations recall that human rights shall not be weaponized or used to either advance political agendas or to meddle in the internal affairs of another state. They stress that such double standards undermine the true spirit of promoting and defending human rights, while both preventing a harmonious environment and progress in this field, and also weakening human rights institutions. The Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations considers that the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR, is a non-discriminatory platform that provides an opportunity to all member states to advance towards the full and effective realization of the human rights in a fair and constructive manner, on the basis of dialogue and cooperation, in terms of mutual respect, and in adherence to the timeless principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, particularly those referred to the sovereign equality of states, the inalienable right to self-determination of peoples, and the non-interference in the internal affairs of states. The member states of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations commend the efforts of the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in many fields, including on human rights, with the purpose of ensuring the well-being and prosperity of its people. We call on the continuation of such efforts, as well as on the need to ensure that they are nationally owned, while stressing the primary role of the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and its institutions in this regard. The Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations calls for an end to the ongoing practice of the Security Council of dealing with issues and situations beyond its mandate, including by addressing human rights issues in pursuit of certain states' political objectives. The continuation of this practice infringes upon the spirit that must guide the higher ideals in favor of the genuine promotion and protection of human rights. New York, 12 June 2024. I thank you very much.
I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, thank you for this invitation. I welcome the attention that the Council pays to the precarious human rights situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and to working through the interconnections between human rights, peace and security, as well as development. The protracted nature of this situation is trapping people in unmitigated suffering. It is also a factor behind instability with wider regional ramifications. It is not possible to divorce the state of human rights in the DPRK from considerations around peace and security in the peninsula, including increasing militarization on the part of the DPRK. Today, the DPRK is a country sealed off from the world, a stifling, claustrophobic environment where life is a daily struggle devoid of hope. And I'm asserting this against the backdrop of a number of factors that we have observed of late. First, deepening repression of the right to freedom of movement. Recent months have seen a very partial reopening of the border, allowing limited movement, some citizens returning home, a small number of incoming diplomats, and some travel by government delegations and sports teams. The brutal reality, though, for the population at large remains one of strengthened border controls. It is now almost impossible for people to leave unless they have the permission of the government. Extremely few people secure this. But leaving your own country is not a crime. On the contrary, it is a human right recognized by international law. Last year, around 200 escapees from the DPRK arrived in the Republic of Korea. Less than 1/5 of pre-COVID arrivals. Of those who arrived, only a small percentage had actually left the DPRK after the COVID border closures in early 2020, the majority having been in third countries. In short, we are witnessing a situation where people can no longer leave, even when they are in the most desperate of circumstances or at peril of persecution. One consequence is that divided families are even more divided. No departures means no reunification with families abroad. Even the briefest of meetings between separated relatives no longer occur, as official efforts on this front have stalled for years. And phoning or sending money to family in the DPRK is now almost practically impossible. Yet, that's exactly what would build some sense of confidence and hope. This arbitrary interference in family life causes deep anguish. I urge the DPRK to reopen possibilities for families to connect and ultimately to be together. Second, repression of freedom of expression has worsened, particularly as a result of enforcement of 3 laws. One deals with the consumption of foreign media, which are deemed to be, and I quote, reactionary thought. Another criminalizes the use of language not in line with the Pyongyang dialogue, while a third focuses on forcing youth, and I quote, to conform to a socialist lifestyle. All of these impose harsh punishments for the exercise of fundamental human rights protected by international law, including the right to freedom of expression and right to access and impart information, going so far as to punish parents for the actions of their children. Article 7 of the Reactionary Thought and Culture Denunciation Law is a particularly chilling example, authorizing severe sanctions, including capital punishment, for the offense of introducing, viewing, or disseminating so-called reactionary culture. Put simply, people in the DPRK are at risk of death for merely watching or sharing a foreign television series. This law squarely violates freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, and the right to take part in cultural life, putting the DPRK in clear breach of its obligations under international law. I urge the country to repeal these oppressive laws and to institute a moratorium on the use of the death penalty throughout its legal system with a view to its abolition, as is the overwhelming global trend. Third, the socio-economic conditions of life in the DPRK have become unbearably harsh. I'm particularly troubled about the lack of access to food. Every single person interviewed by my office has mentioned this in one form or another. In the words of one, it's very easy to become fragile and malnourished because there's nothing to eat. While the government seems to be making some efforts to address food security, it is at the same time shutting down the majority of small-scale markets, the Zhangmadang, and restricting what vendors can sell in the rest. This increasingly centralized food production and distribution are undermining access to food. Reports indicate almost half of the population as food insecure in recent years, with child wasting on the rise in some provinces. I call on the government to fulfill the right to food of all of its citizens without discrimination and to take advantage of offers of international cooperation to this end. Fourth, forced labor persists in many forms inside the DPRK. The government also exerts a high level of control on workers sent abroad, many of whom have been interviewed by my office. They describe a life of terrible hardship, work that is often physically dangerous, a scarcity of food and healthcare, extreme levels of surveillance, physical violence, and the confiscation of up to 90% of their wages by the state. Moreover, arbitrary detention, torture, and ill treatment, as well as a lack of fair trials, are ongoing tactics of repression. I've also consistently raised the tragic issue of enforced disappearance, both inside the DPRK and of citizens of other countries, notably the Republic of Korea and Japan, perpetrated over the past 70 years. Painfully, the full truth as to the fate of these people, which we estimate to be over 100,000, remains unknown to this day. I again call on the DPRK to comply with its international obligations to return these individuals to their long-suffering families or reveal their fate and return remains to loved ones. Accountability for these long-standing, serious and widespread violations need to be a priority. 10 years ago, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK called on the Council to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, which I endorse. In addition, I urge states to explore avenues for judicial accountability that may be at their disposal, including under accepted principles of extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction in accordance with international law. As for non-judicial routes, these must remain part of our collective effort to bring redress to victims. Truth-telling, memorialization, the reparations issue, and guarantees of non-recurrence all must be advanced. And I recognize the enormous contribution of civil society in consistently documenting violations and supporting victims. I will be providing, at the request of the Human Rights Council, a comprehensive report on the human rights situation over the last 10 years next year in 25. Given the precarious human rights situation in the DPRK, there are compelling reasons for recognizing international protection needs of those seeking it outside of the country. It is essential that the principle of non-refoulement is scrupulously observed. We have received troubling reports of people being deported back to the DPRK in clear violation of international law. Our monitoring confirms that individuals forced back in this manner are subjected to torture, arbitrary detention, or other serious human rights violations. Mr. President, it is important that the international community continues to pay close attention to this most troubling human rights situation. This Council is uniquely placed to address the growing isolation of the country, which is a driver of both human rights violations and regional instability. It is really critical for the international community to be creative in finding ways to revive dialogue. We have seen some positive signs recently from DPRK in their engagement with the international human rights system, which is welcome. The upcoming Universal Periodic Review session this November and the 2025 review process of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities each provide an opportunity to be grasped. The landscape of misery, repression, fear, hunger, and hopelessness in the DPRK is profoundly alarming. All paths out of this start with making a U-turn from the dead end of the self-imposed isolation, opening the country, re-engaging with the international community, enabling people-to-people contact, embracing international cooperation, and focusing on the well-being of all people. I urge the government of the DPRK to flip the orthodoxies and overcome its isolationist mindset, which only breeds deeper and deeper distrust, setting off a never-ending spiral of groupthink at the expense of a more prosperous and secure future for its people. Human rights in all their dimensions offer a solution and a way forward. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Turk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today in Geneva, the Secretary General opened the celebrations marking the 60th anniversary of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, now known as UN Trade and Development, or UNCTAD for short. He said that UNCTAD has a proud and long-standing record of contributing to discussions on reforming the international financial architecture. It has been a powerful force for change at the global level, shaping narratives, influencing international negotiations, and advancing the cause of multilateralism. He then spoke to the press in Geneva in advance of his attendance at the forthcoming G7 meeting in Italy. He said that we face profound global challenges on multiple fronts and that G7 leaders have a particular responsibility. First, on climate, he said, the G7 needs to commit to end coal power by 2030. He added that they need to act on the international financial architecture, which he said is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. The rich are overrepresented, the poor are underserved. And we must act urgently on artificial intelligence, another of the items for the G7, a central question of governance today. Regarding Gaza, Mr. Guterres said that he welcomed President Biden's recent peace initiative and urged all parties to seize the opportunity for a ceasefire and release of the hostages and prepare the ground for a two-state solution. He added that we must also keep working for peace in Ukraine, a just peace based on the United Nations Charter and international law. We will share his remarks. And he recently delivered remarks at the International Telecommunication Union, which we have shared with you. Ahead of the Group of Seven summit starting tomorrow, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, is appealing to G7 leaders to use their influence to prevent man-made famine. In a statement issued earlier today, he warned that conflict is fueling hunger in too many corners of the world, from Mali to Myanmar. But he said nowhere is the choice between inaction and oblivion so clear as in Gaza and Sudan. In Gaza, half of the population, more than 1 million people, could face death and starvation by the middle of July. In Sudan, at least 5 million people are also teetering on the brink of starvation, including in war-torn parts of Al Jazeera, Darfur, Khartoum, and Kordofan. Mr. Griffith said that waiting for an official declaration of famine before acting would be a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of people and a moral outrage. He called on G7 countries to bring their substantial political leverage and financial resources to bear so that aid organizations can reach all people in need. Turning to the situation in Gaza, UNICEF warns that nearly 3,000 children in southern Gaza have been cut off from treatment for moderate and severe acute malnutrition, putting them at risk of death. The agency is also concerned that malnutrition cases could continue to rise when treatment services are collapsing. Only 2 of 3 stabilization centers that treat seriously malnourished children in Gaza are still functioning. UNICEF says that plans for the opening of new centers have been delayed due to ongoing military operations across the Strip. According to the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, escalating hostilities across Gaza continue to pose significant barriers to accessing healthcare. Despite these challenges, our humanitarian partners are currently reaching some 280,000 people per week in Gaza with health services. Meanwhile, a shortage of cooking gas and the absence of a public power supply is hindering efforts to keep community kitchens and bakeries running. Efforts to distribute food remain constrained by the active fighting, damaged roads, limited number of entry points into Gaza, suboptimal operating hours at crossings and checkpoints, and the limited number of trucks allowed access. Meanwhile, OCHA says that the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues to escalate amid ongoing violence by Israeli forces and settlers. Since the 7th of October, more than 520 Palestinians, nearly a quarter of them children, have been killed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Almost 3/4 of those fatalities occurred during operations by Israeli forces. During the same period, more than 5,200 Palestinians were injured in those areas. OCHA says that violence against Palestinians by Israeli settlers is also on the rise, with more than 960 such attacks reported in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, since the 7th of October. This morning, Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, briefed Security Council members on the situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Mr. Turk said that the situation in the country is trapping people in unmitigated suffering and is also a factor behind instability with wider regional ramifications. Mr. Turk underscored that it is not possible to divorce the state of human rights in the DPRK from considerations around peace and security in the peninsula, including the increasing militarization on the part of the DPRK. He pointed to several factors that are contributing to the dire human rights situation. These include the deepening repression of the right of freedom of movement, the repression of freedom of expression, the harsh socioeconomic conditions, and the persistence of forced labor. Accountability for these long-standing, serious, and widespread violations needs to be a priority, Mr. Turk said. His full statement is online. Turning now to South Sudan, the humanitarian community is working to support the most urgent needs of hundreds of thousands of people, including those fleeing the conflict in neighboring Sudan and host communities. Yesterday, the humanitarian coordinator in South Sudan, Anita Kiki Gabeso, released $20 million from the South Sudan Humanitarian Fund to provide life-saving assistance to some 290,000 of the most vulnerable people in 4 locations near the border with Sudan. Some 700,000 people have crossed into South Sudan since April 2023, when conflict erupted in Sudan. This is the first allocation of the year and comes at a critical time to prevent the hunger situation in South Sudan from worsening, with the current lean situation expected to increase levels of food insecurity and malnutrition. Ms. Gabeho said that despite generous contributions from donors, additional funding is needed. 5 months into the year, the 2024 Humanitarian Response Plan for South Sudan is less than 20% funded, with $327 million received of the $1.8 billion required. Our peacekeeping colleagues in the Democratic Republic of the Congo have dispatched a patrol to protect civilians in response to clashes between members of the Zaire and Codeco armed groups at a mining site about 40 kilometers from Bunia in Ituri province. Several civilian casualties were reported. A team comprising civilian and military staff also conducted a mission to the Bikima area, about 65 kilometers southwest of Bunia, to engage with community members and displaced civilians impacted by attacks by the ADF. Over 700 families fled their homes due to ADF attacks in March and April. And since the 25th of May, more than 100 civilians have been killed following a series of ADF attacks in Ituri and North Kivu. Our peacekeeping colleagues in the Central African Republic continue to support the government in strengthening the rule of law and essential criminal justice services to prevent conflict and lay the foundations for sustainable peace. As part of these efforts, the UN mission conducted risk assessment training for 54 prison officers, including 12 women, who work in prisons in Bangui and 7 other cities. The training focused on enhancing the security and management of penitentiary facilities while improving the reintegration of detainees. Separately, peacekeepers in the country's west are conducting patrols in many areas to prevent armed elements infiltration. This morning, representing the Secretary General at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, which is taking place in Berlin, the UN Development Program Administrator, Achim Steiner, said that where the security situation allows, the UN has significantly scaled up its recovery efforts, implementing $1.1 billion of recovery and development programming in 2022 and 2023, and expecting to invest another $1 billion in 2024. He said that this is promoting a gender-responsive, inclusive, and green recovery. On the ground, the UN team today said that it has ramped up our recovery efforts across the country in the first months of 2024. Our team said that activities include mine action campaigns that reached more than 300,000 children and caregivers in March and April alone, as well as support to the energy sector. And we've been asked about our representation at the conference on Ukraine taking place in Switzerland. I can say that at the invitation of the President of the Swiss Confederation, the United Nations will be represented as an observer at the senior level in the forthcoming summit taking place in Bürgenstock, Switzerland on the 15th and 16th of June. This is consistent with previous UN participation in discussions related to peace in Ukraine. The United Nations reiterates its support for just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter and international law and relevant General Assembly resolutions. I have a statement on the death of Vice President Saulos Chilima of the Republic of Malawi. The Secretary General is deeply saddened by the tragic death of His Excellency Dr. Saulos Klaus Chilima, Vice President of the Republic of Malawi, and 9 others in an airplane crash on the 10th of June in the Chikangawa forest in Malawi. The Secretary General conveys his sincere condolences to the government and the people of Malawi for the loss of Vice President Chilima. He also extends his condolences to the families and loved ones of the deceased. The United Nations stands in solidarity with Malawians in this difficult period. A new report released today by the UN and partners says that the world remains off course to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 7 for energy by 2030. The joint report by the International Renewable Energy Agency, the United Nations Statistics Division, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the International Energy Agency warns that the global energy access gap is worsening as population growth outpaces new connections. 685 million people were living without electricity in 2022, and 2.1 billion people continue to rely on damaging cooking fuels globally. However, the report also says that renewable energy has seen robust growth over the past 2 years, and energy efficiency improvements are gradually improving after a drop-off during the pandemic. The full report is online. Today is the World Day Against Child Labor, and this year's theme is Let's Act on Our Commitments, End Child Labor. The International Labour Organization points out that while much progress has been made in reducing child labor over the years, recent years have seen global trends reverse. According to the ILO, almost 1 in 10 children worldwide are in child labor. And for briefings, tomorrow at 10 a.m., the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, will be here in this room to brief you on the latest Children and Armed Conflict report. Are there any questions for me before we turn to Monica? Yes, Gabriel.
Thank you, Farhan. Do you have any update on the World Food Program pause of using the U.S.-built pier in Gaza, and what are the results of the security review?
The security review is ongoing. I don't have any progress to tell you. So the World Food Program, in its capacity as the head of logistics for these arrangements, is continuing with its pause.
Can I ask a follow-up on the Human Rights Council, the report of the Independent International Commission on the Inquiry of the OPT in Israel released their report in overnight our time. Mm-hmm. Has the Secretary General seen it, and what's his reaction to it?
Well, this is a report by the Commission of Inquiry. They spent a lot of work on it, and it's a very serious document. It will be now reviewed by the Human Rights Council, so we, for now, are leaving the matter in their hands. But obviously there are many different reports involving human rights and the rights of different groups that have been focusing on the conflict in Gaza and the situation on October 7th, and all of those reports need to be looked at seriously. Deji.
Yes, a follow-up on the report by COI. What does this report mean if the Human Rights Council has adopted or taken any actions on this report? Can it be an evidence for both Hamas and Israel that committed war crime?
Ultimately, it's up to the judicial bodies looking into questions about what sort of evidence they will use. We don't know what follow-up bodies there will be on the ground, but as you know, both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice have been looking at the various situations, and it's up to them to determine what kind of information they will use as evidence.
So the permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations said, and I quote, "The COI has once again proven that its actions are all in the service of a narrow-led political agenda against Israel." What's the response from the Secretary General on this comment?
I wouldn't respond to any of the comments by the ambassador. I would stand up for the professionalism of the work done by the various bodies, including the Commission of Inquiry.
Okay, a totally different topic on Ukraine. Can we get any information on who will participate the peace summit in Switzerland represented the United Nations?
I'll be able to tell you that in a couple of days.
Okay, so and today the U.S. is arguing that they might push a policy to offer loans of 50 billions to Ukraine using the profits from the frozen assets of Russian central bank. What's the position of UN on this policy? Do you think that's technically speaking legal?
I don't have anything to say about the legality of this. This is a bilateral effort between the United States and Ukraine, and so you'll need to follow up with those respective governments about how they're how they're pursuing this. Stefano.
Thank you, Farhan. About the G7 and what Secretary General just said in Geneva before arriving in Italy. His speech to journalists is concentrated on climate change. But in the G7, in the agenda of the G7, it looks like this is not anymore a point, at the top, actually. Even AI is before this. So how the Secretary General is going to convince those big powers, and it's not only the G7, that there is India, Brazil, and so on, that actually, like he said at the museum last week, at the Natural History Museum, this is the most important issue at the moment.
Well, I'd refer you to what he said in the press conference today, where he laid out the case for the seriousness of this issue. But, of course, it's not just that. You'll have seen the reports we've put out. You saw what he had to say at the American Museum of Natural History a week ago. We are in a moment where if we do not act, there will be a crisis. And what he is saying is that the nations of the world, and particularly the G7, need to move now to avoid a catastrophe down the line. He will be giving some remarks while he is at different side panels at the G7 talks, and we'll share with you what he says then as well.
Just a quick follow-up, but isn't it worry about the recent election in Europe? The Green parties, or usually Europe has been very sensitive to the issue. Instead, who won are all the parties that are not so sensitive about this issue.
It really is not an issue so much who is in the governments. All governments need to take this seriously because the data shows how serious the situation is. Whether we're talking about catastrophic weather events, whether we're talking about ongoing desertification, whether we're talking about the melting of polar ice, there's any number of different problems the world will have to face collectively, and we need to deal with this collectively now. Bassine?
I just wanted to follow up on the reports over the weekend that Israeli forces had used an aid truck to infiltrate the Nusayrat camp. And, I mean, the Palestinian Red Crescent put out a statement yesterday saying that they did and that they had warned from such a scenario. I understand there's an investigation. If you have an update on this and if more information has been gathered since.
Well, there's no update to say on this beyond our principled position, which is that humanitarian aid must not be used and must not be perceived as taking any side in a conflict. The safety of our humanitarian workers depends on all sides and the communities on the ground trusting their impartiality. And that is something we will always try to reinforce. And with that, Monica Villela-Grayley will now speak to you.
Thank Mr. Turk for
Thank you so much, Farhan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you again. I will start with the trip that the PJ is undertaken to South Sudan. The President of the General Assembly, Mr. Denis Francis, arrived earlier today in Juba, capital of South Sudan, for an official visit. The PJ was welcomed by the country's Deputy Foreign Minister, His Excellency Mr. Monday Semaya Kumba, Ms. Kiki Ngebo, the UN Resident Coordinator in South Sudan, and the Permanent Representative of South Sudan to the United Nations, Her Excellency Ms. Cecilia A.M. Adeng. President Francis expressed his interest in connecting with the people and the government of South Sudan. He will also take the opportunity to further strengthen and foster cooperation between the Republic of South Sudan and the United Nations, and to demonstrate his full support and that of the General Assembly for the ongoing efforts to consolidate peace, security, development in the country, the Horn of Africa, as well as in the entire African region. While in Juba, Mr. Francis will pay a courtesy call on the President of South Sudan, His Excellency Mr. Salva Kiir Mayardit, and hold separate bilateral meetings with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, His Excellency Mr. Ramadan Abdallah Gok Ayu, as well as other cabinet members. The PJ plans to engage with representatives of civil society organizations, university students, female peacekeepers, and children during a radio show. Mr. Francis and his delegation arrives in South Sudan following an official visit to Tajikistan, where he attended the third high-level international conference on the International Decade for Action, Water for Sustainable Development. The President of the General Assembly issued a post on his ex-social media account expressing his deepest condolences to the government and people of Malawi on the tragic loss of the country's Vice President, His Excellency Mr. Saulus Klaus Chilima, as well as 9 other members of the Vice President's delegation during a plane crash on Monday in the north of Malawi. PJ Denis Francis said that his thoughts and his prayers are with the families and loved ones during this difficult time. The PJ has appointed 2 co-facilitators to conduct the intergovernmental consultations on a brief, concise, action-oriented declaration as part of the high-level 2025 UN Conference to support the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. The co-facilitators will be Her Excellency Ms. Tânia Serafim Ivone Romualdo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Cabo Verde to the UN, and His Excellency Mr. James Martin Larson, Permanent Representative of Australia to the United Nations. And the declaration is to be concluded by 1st May 2025, next year, and adopted by consensus at the high-level 2025 UN Conference on this matter. Looking forward, President Denis Francis has recorded a video message to mark the 3rd International Day for Countering Hate Speech on 18th June. The PJ's video will be showed during the high-level event to celebrate the International Day, which this year focuses on investing in the power of youth for countering and addressing hate speech. According to the UN, the world has 1.2 billion young people aged 15 to 24 years, which represents 16% of the global population. Mr. Francis believes that hate speech has become one of the most virulent methods used to spread divisive rhetoric and ideologies. Its pernicious impacts amplified by new communications and social media technologies that relentlessly torment its targets. The event is co-organized by the Mission of the Kingdom of Morocco to the United Nations and the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. The meeting will take place from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on 18 June at the ECOSOC Chamber for your diaries. And tomorrow, 13 June, the GA will hold informal consultations on the Summit of the Future in the afternoon. You know by now. Member states will also hold informal consultations on the high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance tomorrow morning and on Friday, 14th June. Also, Friday morning, there will be an informal consultation, or I should say informal consultations, plural, to discuss the high-level meeting on addressing the existential threats posed by sea level rise. On 19 June, the General Assembly will hold a plenary meeting on the implementation of the Declaration of Commitment on HIV/AIDS and the Political Declaration on HIV/AIDS. And for all of you interested in the Security Council reform, on Thursday and Friday next week, the GA will hold an informal meeting on the plenary of the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council and other matters. So why am I giving...
Okay, thank you for listening, and some final thoughts. We need to actually have an open mind about what is happening in other governments in other countries. We cannot expect there to be a one-size-fits-all sort of government. People need to be able to make up their minds about how they want to live and what is acceptable from their government. At the same time, that people should be free to live, and if a government, in this case the Democratic Republic of the People of Korea, are restricting people from being able to experience other cultures, then maybe that is a question that needs to be answered by other governments in global situations. Should a government be allowed to completely restrict the outside world from being able to enter their world? So, we need to face things with an open mind and open heart so that we all can live a full and abundant life and spread the love around our world. Thank you for listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. Please find that subscribe button wherever it may be and give us some support so that we can keep reporting and keep finding human rights news from around the world. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. please contact us at depictions.media for more information.